Welcome back, everyone, to day 3 of SAG-AFTRA's Stop the Hate Summit. Gabrielle Carteris, our president, and I are so pleased to have all of you back for this next panel. The very concept of stopping the hate is emotional, which is important. It's an important piece of the conversation, but it only goes so far without data. We need data to address racism and hate. And whatever we do to address it is always strengthened when we bring data and hardcore information into the conversation. So we're going to do that now. We are fortunate to have at our fingertips 8 years of annual reports on the state of diversity in front of and behind the camera in Hollywood, film, and television to help us consider the relationship between on-screen diversity and film and television ratings, as well as to grapple with the important best practices for moving the needle on Hollywood diversity and inclusion. To guide our thinking, it's really a great honor to welcome Dr. Darnell Hunt, Professor and Dean of Social Sciences at UCLA and the Director of UCLA's Ralph J. Bunche Center for African American Studies. Dr. Hunt, welcome to you, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you, David. Really happy to be here today. Okay, I'm going to share my screen now so that we can take a look at the PowerPoint. All right, I think I'm broadcasting here. Okay, so this, as David pointed out, is an 8-year longitudinal study. And for us, that's really important because it's allowed us to track trends over time. And we partnered in this process with the Institute for Research on Labor and Employment at UCLA. So this particular report, the 2020 Hollywood Diversity Report, examines films and television shows from 2019 and the 2018-19 television season. We're going to be releasing a new report next Thursday, actually, the 2021 Hollywood Diversity Report, which focuses exclusively on film, and the TV version will come out in the fall, right before Emmys. The title of the study from 2020 was A Tale of Two Hollywoods, and I think you'll see in a few moments why we subtitled the report this. Okay, the first thing I'd like to do is take a look at the US population, and we're focusing primarily on race and ethnicity here. And you see the timeline from about 1960 to about 2050. The blue line shows you what's happening with the white population, white non-Hispanic population. And the gold line shows you what's happening with people of color. And you see here the two lines cross. Somewhere around 2043, demographers tell us, the US will become a majority-minority country. In fact, we're becoming more diverse by about 0.5%, a little bit less than 0.5% each year in terms of the people of color share of the population. What this means is that the market for Hollywood films and television, the audience is becoming much, much more diverse. And one of the things we'll see from our data is that diverse audiences increasingly demand diverse content. So let me talk for a few moments to you about the data for this report. This study is completely rooted in credits. That is to say, a very reliable source of data that allows us to track over time the inclusion of women and people of color in the industry. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to look at other dimensions of diversity to the degree we like because the data just aren't available. For example, LGBTQ status is something we're very interested in, but we have not been able to track it reliably because the data often aren't there. Disability, we haven't been able to track that reliably. So I think going forward, when we start to do content analyses, which actually look at the characters by watching programming, we'll be able to talk a little bit more about those dimensions of diversity. But the study I'm going to discuss today is rooted primarily in credits data that we've been tracking year over year for the last 8 years. So the first thing I want to point out for this particular report, we look at 146 films released in 2019. And what we do is we look at the top films ranked by box office. We also looked at 463 scripted TV shows from the 2018-19 television season. We look at lead talent, race and gender. We look at director, race and gender. We look at show creator, race and gender. We look at writer diversity. And we look at box office figures, audience demographics, and international markets to kind of get a sense of what the impact of diversity is on the bottom line. We also, for television, look at household, viewer, and social media ratings to do the same type of analysis. So let me just quickly review some top-line findings from film. And here we're looking at film leads by race. Now, one of the things that I'll point out is that there's a gold line here on the chart, you'll see in a moment, which tracks what's happening with the minority population over time. And what we do is we compare that to the US population for minorities, and then of course, whites, to see how the various groups are progressing related to one another. In 2012, you saw that about 84.9% of the film leads were white. This decreased to about 72.4% in 2019. And here's the corresponding line for people of color. About 15.1% of the leads in 2012 and 27.6% by 2019. But you see here, when we look at the US population share for people of color, which is about 40.2% in 2019, there was a big gap between the representation of people of color among film leads and their share of the population, about a 13 percentage point gap. In other words, people of color would have to not quite double their share of leads to reach proportionate representation in this arena. But you see the trend is an upward one. So that's, I guess, positive, but we still have a long ways to go. If we look at gender and do the same type of analysis, we see that the share that men had of film leads was 69.2% in 2012, decreasing to about 55.9% in 2019. And here's the corresponding line for women, 30.8% in 2012, up to 44.1% by 2019. So again, we see an upward trend, and we actually see the gap closing. We're not there yet, because women, of course, constitute a little bit more than half the population. Let's look at film directors. Here again, you see 89% of the film directors were white in 2012. That figure declined, but not by that much, to about 85.6% by 2019. Here's the corresponding line for people of color, 11% in 2012, up to 14.4% in 2019. And here's the population line to show you the gap, how far we have to go. Here you see that people of color would have to more than triple their share of directors to reach proportionate representation in this arena. So we have a long ways to go in terms of directors. Here's the analysis for gender. 94.2% of the directors in 2012 were men, 84.9% in 2019. So you do see an uptick for women, but again, we have a long way to go, as you can see by the gap here. 5.8%, only 5.8% of the directors were women in 2012. That number nearly tripled to 15.1% in 2019, but women would have to triple that share again to reach proportionate representation. So we have a long way to go in the arena of directing for women. What about film writers? 92.2% were white in 2012. That share decreased to about 86.1% by 2019. Here's the corresponding line for people of color, 7.8% in 2012, 13.9% in 2019. You see that people of color more than doubled, well, not quite doubled their share between 2012 and 2019. But again, when we look at the population line, we still have a long way to go before people of color reach proportionate representation among the credited writers in film. And here's the analysis for gender for film writers. 87% were male in 2012, 82.6% in 2019. So not a lot of change for women, only from 13% in 2012 to about 17.4% in 2019. So again, women, slightly more than half the population, are woefully underrepresented among the writers credited in film. This is an important slide because it talks about, as I see it, one of the key problems in the industry. And that's that the executive suites tend to be overwhelmingly white and male, which crowds out the opportunity for people of color and women to occupy those all-important decision-making positions about what types of projects get greenlighted. And you see here from 2020 that 91% of the chair, CEO, the very top positions at the studios were white, and 82% of those positions were male. If you move down a level in the executive suites to the senior executives, you see that 93% were white and 80% were male. And then when you look at unit heads, like the head of casting, marketing, and so forth, 86% white and a little bit more diverse in terms of gender, 59% male. But you can see here that people of color are largely shut out from these important decision-making positions, which explains a lot of the downstream effects we see in the lack of diversity in Hollywood. Okay, we're going to shift now to television and talk about some of the findings from the 2020 report as it relates to TV. Here, if we look at broadcast leads by race, and this is the same type of analysis we did with film, we see that 94.9% of the leads in broadcast for the 2011-12 season were white. That share declined to 76% by 2018-19. Here's the corresponding line for people of color, 5.1% in 2011-12, up to 24% in 2018-19, nearly 5 times the share from 2011-12. So there's been quite a bit of progress in broadcast TV among leads for people of color. But as you can see from the population line, we still have a ways to go. 24% is about 16 percentage points below the people of color share of the US population. Let's look at broadcast leads by gender. 51.5% were male in 2011-12, 55.2% were male in 2018-19. In other words, women have taken a step or so backwards among leads in broadcast TV, from near parity when we first started this study 8 years ago to about a 7 percentage point or 8 percentage point gap by 2018-19. We also look at cable separately, and as you'll see in a moment, we also look at digital. But if we look at cable leads by race, we see that in 2011-12, 85.3% of the leads were white, down to 65% in 2018-19. The corresponding line for people of color, 14.7% in 2011-12, all the way up to 35% in 2018-19. So again, people of color more than doubled their share of leads in the cable arena over the course of this report series. And as you can see from the population line, people of color in 2018-19 were getting very close to proportionate representation. They had about a 6% gap, but that's the smallest gap we've seen over the course of the report series. If we look at cable leads by gender, 62.8% were male in 2011-12, 55.2% in 2018-19. So it's kind of the reverse of the pattern we saw in broadcast. Here, women actually made some gains over the course of the report series. Not major, but the gap isn't that great. It was about 11 percentage points, or 10 percentage points in 2018-19, from 37.1% in 2011-12 up to 44.8% in 2018-19. If we move to the digital arena, we see here that in 2013-14, and again, we have a shorter time horizon here because digital really took off after 2013-14. We see that 90.9% of the digital leads were white in 2013-14, 75.9% in 2018-19. The corresponding line for people of color shows quite a bit of progress from 9.1% in 2013-14 all the way up to 24.1% in 2018-19. Almost tripling their share over the course of the period we looked at in this report. But as you can see from the population line, unlike the story we saw in cable, where people of color were getting close to proportionate representation, we still have quite a ways to go in the digital arena, at least as of 2018-19. People of color would have to nearly double their share to reach proportionate representation. If we look at digital leads by gender, 64.7% in 2013-14 were male, down to 50.6% in 2018-19. And again, the corresponding line for women, 35.3% in 2013-14, up to 49.4% in 2018-19. So here, women have reached proportionate representation, or very close. You can see the gap has almost completely closed from what we saw the first year we looked at this arena. So what about show creators, those all-important people who actually come up with the ideas for shows? and who pitched the idea. And of course, that leads to all kinds of other decisions like casting and who might direct, who might be the showrunner, and so forth and so on. If we look at broadcast show creators by race, we see that 95.8% of show creators in 2011-12 were white. In other words, almost all of the shows that were on the air were created by white people in 2011-12. That share decreased to 89.3% in 2018-19. And here's the corresponding line for people of color, from 4.2% in 2011-12, more than doubling to 10.7% in 2018-19. But as you can see from the population line, we're not even close. We have a long way to go before people of color are in a position to actually create the shows that people see, which have a huge impact on everything else we're talking about today. In fact, people of color would have to nearly quadruple their 2018-19 share to reach proportionate representation among broadcast show creators. If we look at the same issue by gender, we see that 73.5% of the show creators in broadcast were male in 2011-12, down to 71.9% in 2018-19. And here's the corresponding line for women, 26.5% in 2011-12, up to 28.1% in 2018-19. Again, some progress, but still a long way to go. You can see the gap between women and men that existed in 2018-19 among broadcast show creators. If we look at cable show creators, in 2011-12, 92.6% were white, 85.5% by 2018-19 were white. The corresponding line for people of color, 7.4% in 2011-12, up to 14.5% in 2018-19. So again, people of color doubled their share of cable show creators over the report series, but as the population line shows, they still have a long way to go. They'd have to basically triple their share to reach proportionate representation. Women show creators in cable, 78.5% in 2011-12, 77.6% in 2018-19 were male. Here's the line for women, 21.5% in 2011-12, up to 22.4% in 2018-19. Again, you see almost no change here, and the gap is quite large. Women have a long way to go before they reach parity with men among cable show creators. If we move to the digital arena by race, 93.8% of the show creators in 2013-14 were white, 89.7% in 2018-19, a drop, not that large. And here's the corresponding line for people of color, 6.2% in 2013-14, up to 10.3% in 2018-19. Again, an increase, but not that great, because if you look at the population line, again, people of color would have to quadruple their share to reach proportionate representation. Digital show creators by gender, 84.4% were male in 2013-14, 71.4% were male in 2018-19. Here, women nearly doubled their share from 15.6% in 2013-14 up to 28.6% in 2018-19. But as we saw earlier, the gap is still quite large in the digital arena for women, show creators. So for writers, we look at those writers who are credited for pinning the episodes in a given season of a TV show. And 92.3% of those writers in 2012-13 were white, down to 76.6% in 2018-19. And for people of color, you can see that they more than doubled their share from 9.7% in 2012-13 up to 23.4% in 2018-19. Again, though, if you look at the population, people of color would have to nearly double their share again to reach proportionate representation among the writers credited for the episodes in broadcast. If we look at credited cable writers by race, 88.2% were white in 2012-13, down to 74.2% in 2018-19. And here you have the corresponding line for people of color, 11.8% in 2012-13, more than doubling to 25.8% in 2018-19. But as we saw in broadcast, we still have a ways to go before we reach proportionate representation for writers of color in cable. And credited digital writers by race, 89.2% were white in 2014-15, 77.2% were white in 2018-19. And you can see here that writers of color in digital more than doubled from 10.8% of the digital writers in 2014-15 to 22.8% in 2018-19. But again, you see a similar gap, when you look at the population in terms of what that share would have to do to reach parity. They'd have to, again, almost double their share to reach parity in the digital space. Like we did in film, we looked at the executive suites in TV. We looked at the major networks, and what we found was a very similar story. 92% of the top executives, the chairs and CEOs, were white, 68% were male. When we looked at senior executives, one level down, 84% were white, 60% were male. And when we looked at unit heads, like the head of comedy development, drama development, et cetera, 87% were white, 54% were male. So in television, we saw a similar story in terms of race, that is to say, whites dominating these important greenlighting decision-making positions. But we saw a little bit more gender diversity. It wasn't quite as male as what we saw in film, but nonetheless, men were still in the majority in all of these positions, and it was typically white men. Okay, so I want to wrap up by talking about what all this means with respect to the bottom line, which for us was a core component of our study. What we really wanted to do was take a look with hard data at what the relationships were between diversity, the types of diversity that I just talked about, and the actual bottom line. That is to say, what audiences want today. And just keep in mind, as I pointed out at the beginning of this conversation, people of color are becoming, a huge part. I mean, they already are a huge part of the market, but that share is growing each year by about 0.5%, to the point where we're going to be a majority minority nation in a couple of decades. And in some ways, as we'll see, the market audiences are already being driven by demands that audience members of color have about the types of stories and characters they want to see. So this first chart looks at box office by minority cast share for theatrical films from 2019. And let me just take a quick moment here to explain how this works. What we did was we took all of the films in our analysis and we put them into 6 different buckets. And those buckets were labeled based on the diversity of the films. We look at the top 8 credited actors and we ask, what is their gender, what is their race? And for films that had casts that were less than 11% people of color, we put them in that first bucket to the left, all the way to films that were from 11 to 20% people of color, 21 to 30, 31 to 40, 41 to 50, and then over 50%. That is to say, where the cast was majority minority. And the question we ask ourselves is, where does median box office peak? And what that's asking basically is, which categories of diversity tend to produce the films that make the most at the box office? So what we see here for 2019 is that films with major casts that were from 41 to 50% people of color actually tended to have the highest box office. And here the median was 76, a little bit over 76 million. What's also notable is the films that were least diverse, that is to say, with casts that were less than 11% people of color, were the poorest performers. On average, they tended only to earn about 22 million. So we have to ask ourselves, why is the industry making so many films that aren't very diverse when we know from the data that those films don't tend to do as well, all things equal? And this is a finding that we replicated over multiple years. So it's not just a fluke of 2019. If we do the same type of analysis for television, looking at broadcast scripted TV shows, and again, you see the same buckets below in terms of the major cast for each show, what we find is kind of the reverse. The ratings, the median 18 to 49 ratings, actually were actually highest for the least diverse broadcast scripted TV shows. And that's an interesting finding because it actually cuts against some findings that we found earlier. Typically, what we found over the 8 years of this report series is that TV shows that were from about 31 to 40% people of color, that is to say, where the cast tended to mirror the actual US population, tended to do the best. And those were often ensemble shows where every group had a character they could identify with, and the ratings tended to be higher. But here we saw something of I think, an anomaly over the course of this report series. And we think it could have something to do with the political environment that the nation was in 2019, and the choices that white audiences were making versus other audiences at that point. Because when we look at it for Black households the same year, and we ask the same question, sort of where do ratings peak, in terms of the cast of the makeup of the cast, we see that TV shows with cast over 50% minority had by far the highest Black household ratings. And you see here 4.22 ratings points, which is significantly higher than what you see for the other levels of diversity. If we look at cable and do the same analysis, 18 to 49, we find something quite different than what we saw in broadcast. In cable, ratings peaked for cable television shows that were majority minority. And that could have something to do with the way cable is organized into narrowcasting, networks that tend to target certain groups. And I can just tell you that for African-American households and for Latinx households, the ratings tend to be off the chart for TV shows that told stories about their respective communities. And I think that goes into a lot of what we're seeing here in the cable space. So here are the two reports from 2020, the 2020 Hollywood Diversity Report. Part one was the film report released right before Oscars, and part two, the television report, was released before Emmys. And both of them can be downloaded in their entirety. I gave you just sort of the tip of the iceberg here because there are over 100 tables and charts in each report, but you can download them at socialsciences.ucla.edu. And I look forward to answering any questions you may have now about the report and the findings.
Thank you so much. This was the information and data that you shared, Dr. Hunt, is riveting, truly riveting. And I'm excited that people were able to see this conversation or hear this conversation. I hope they have time to be able to read the research that you did. It's meaningful for all of us. We need to understand what's taking place in our industry. So that's very, very helpful. Before we go, David, I don't know if you want to say anything.
Only to say once again, we've all been reading your reports for years, not just informative, but elevating in terms of the conversation that we are having and that we must have about the industry. So thank you. We have received some comments that I want to talk with you about afterwards about information that we can get related to our performers with disabilities. You may have ideas about that. I know that UCLA puts out a lot of studies, et cetera.
Yeah.
And so for all the information that you have delivered, we thank you, really thank you for taking the time to be here with us.
Well, I appreciate that. We're always looking for ways to partner and to kind of expand the report. So for us, it comes back to data. We have to have data to arrive at reliable conclusions. So anything we can do on those fronts, we'd love to partner with you to try to figure out how to move forward.
Great.
It is so important. It is actually the foundation which we could really grow and become better. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right, everybody, we're going to see you after lunch. If you are elsewhere in the country, maybe you're going to be having dinner. I don't know if you're having breakfast. When we restart, we'll be back at 1:15 Pacific time. So that'll be 4:15 Eastern. And we'll be doing Tired of Talk, How Information Can Drive Latino Inclusion. So I hope you join us. Thank you again, Dr. Hunt, and have a great day.